Welcome back to another episode of Navigating the Wilderness. My name's Nicole Delaney. This podcast is for you if you are going through a difficult season, or maybe you're transitioning from one season to another and you're finding yourself feeling like you're in a fog, like you don't know the way forward. Maybe you having trouble discerning what God is saying to you in this season. My prayer for you is that as you listen to these podcast episodes, that you will become more clear in what God is speaking to you, and you will trust His voice more clearly in your life, that you're able to confidently take the next faithful step. Often God doesn't show us the whole path forward, but He shows us the next faithful step. And as we're confidently taking that next faithful step, then another unfolds, and then another unfolds, and another unfolds, until we're walking with the Lord in dependence upon Him. It's not comfortable necessarily, but we get comfortable with the discomfort of walking with Him, which is something that He does in our life during wilderness seasons especially, so that we can confidently walk in dependence with Him in every season moving forward. This episode, we're going to talk about seasons of flourishing, which I recognize is not necessarily a season that resonates with you if you're in a wilderness. However, I know that it's important to talk about these things when we're in a wilderness season because it helps us better think about how we want to navigate those kind of seasons moving forward, how we want to posture our heart. We learn from the previous seasons of flourishing and the mistakes that we made before we go into a new season of flourishing. So I think it's important to talk about these things. I can look back and recognize things that I could have done differently in previous seasons of flourishing in my life that hopefully I do better in the future. I was thinking a bit about this topic, and it was reminding me of a time in my life that was about 20 years ago when I was first graduating from college, and I was just starting my first job out of college. My parents and my siblings moved away the same weekend that I graduated, and they moved to a new state. And so I was officially on my own with very little family around me, and starting my first job out of college, trying to navigate paying my bills and dealing with the everyday adulting things that you deal with when you're first starting out. I remember it was a challenging season. I had a lot of obstacles I was facing. 4 months into my parents moving away, my car suddenly seized while I was driving and the engine went. And all of a sudden I had to buy a new car. I was trying to figure out how I was going to do that without having my dad around to help me shop for one. And everything worked out. But I remember it being a very uncomfortable season. And at the same time, unfortunately, I made some poor choices. And there was someone I connected with in my life that I was very naive in the way that I thought about things. And this person was a Christian. And I just assumed that because they were a Christian, they had their life together. Unfortunately, they were dealing with a drug addiction I didn't recognize at the time because I wasn't really familiar with addiction or what that looked like. This person ended up stealing from me. Unfortunately, they stole from me when I had my roommate's rent money and my rent money in my wallet, and I was about to deliver it to the clubhouse where I needed to pay rent. All of a sudden, my wallet went missing. And there was some other circumstances surrounding it that kind of indicated what was going on. But it took a little bit for me to figure out what happened. And I was left with a situation where I had no clue how I was going to pay my rent. I was just barely making enough money to survive. And, it was entry-level salary. I might have even picked up a second job. I know I did at one point. I don't know if I had one at this time. But I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I was kind of panicked. And I remember going to church that Sunday. And I remember talking with a friend of mine outside for most of the service. I was so upset that I just wanted to tell, I was just telling her what was going on. And I didn't go into the church service for most of the message. And then finally we went inside and I went to sit in the service. And I remember on the screen in big letters, it said, "Do you trust me?" I don't know what the pastor was preaching on, but for whatever reason, he put those words across the screen. And I remember feeling like the Lord was speaking them to me. And He was saying, "Do you trust me with this situation? Like, you can't fix this." It wasn't something I could fix. But I think I had grown up with this idea that somehow I could be self-sufficient and independent. And some of it came from fear of not having enough finances. Sometimes we grow up with this scarcity mindset, and our world really works to cultivate that in us, to think there's not enough time, there's not enough resources, there's not enough money. And so I grew up with this idea that I had to strive to provide for myself. And it's like all of that was being dismantled in the midst of all of these difficulties because I had no control over what was happening. And unfortunately, some of it was my own fault because I had made a poor decision in trusting this person. But while I was at the church at that time, I remember they were taking the offering up and I had about $100 left to my name. That's all I had left. And I remember feeling this prompting from the Holy Spirit to put the last $100 I had in this offering. And it wasn't so much about the church and that the church needed my money. I think the Lord knew that I needed to trust him and that he wanted to challenge my heart in that, do I trust you with what I have? And I remember thinking, this is crazy. This is all I have is $100. Like, what am I going to do if I give this? But then I thought, well, I'm already down to $100 and I can't pay my rent. So what's another $100? Fine, I'll just put the last 100 in there. What am I going to do about it? I can't pay my rent with this anyway. And I remember putting it in and praying and saying, Lord, I have no idea how you're going to take care of this situation, but I'm trusting that you're going to take care of it somehow. And I'm walking out of the church. And as I'm leaving the church, I come across this older couple that they were often very encouraging. They were probably in their 70s at the time. And they were often praying for me or encouraging me because they knew I was on my own. They knew my parents had moved away. And they were asking me how my week was going and how I was doing. And I think at the time I had just gone through some kind of financial challenge, but I can't remember what it was because they were asking me about that. And I told them about what happened and this person that stole from me and how I didn't have the money for my rent and I was kind of like not sure what I was going to do. And they invited me to their house that day. So I go to their house and I sit down with them and they tell me their story, which I didn't really know much about them. But apparently, and at the time that I went to their house, they lived in a pretty small house. It was a normal size home, pretty modest size home for two people. And they had a nice car, but other than that, they lived in a modest house. And they told me that they had come from a lot of wealth, that the wife actually she was like COO or CFO or something. I can't remember what her title was, but of a very large fashion brand. I won't go into the details of that company, but it's a well-known brand to this day. And she worked for them and was very wealthy. And they were living a very lavish lifestyle for a long time. And they were enjoying life and just kind of living for themselves, but really trusting in finances, trusting in resources. They were trusting in their wealth, right? Which is what the Bible tells us not to do, is to trust in wealth. But that's what they were doing. And they told me that God suddenly brought them to a place where they lost everything. They were stripped of everything and they went through bankruptcy. And I think they were even living in a mobile home for a period of time. I don't remember the circumstances surrounding all of that, of how it happened, but I remember them telling me that they had to live in a mobile home and that they were very humbled and they recognized how they had lived selfishly for themselves and they hadn't been providing for others. They hadn't been blessing others in their life. And they promised God that if God provided for them again and brought them to a place of having an abundance again, that they would live differently, that they would steward the money to bless others, that they wouldn't live for themselves anymore. And so that's what had happened. God had brought them full circle. They were now living in a season of abundance again. They were living in a season of harvest. And they were choosing to bless other people in the midst of that season. So they were living more modestly so they could be more of a blessing to other people. And so they told me, they said, it was a blessing for them to be able to take this off of my shoulders, this situation I was dealing with. And they wrote me this really generous check that covered my rent and covered any expenses I had for a couple of weeks so that I was kind of caught up. And at the same time, they didn't just take that away from me. They sat me down and they walked through a budgeting process with me. And they showed me how they do their budget and how it's really worked for them. And it was a way that I had never learned before. And I was so blessed that they took this time with me. I sat with them for a few hours and we went over a spreadsheet of how I could track my finances, how I could better steward finances going forward. And I took so many lessons from them into my future. It was such an amazing experience and a lesson for me. And I remember walking out to my car after I left their house and saying to God, I want to do that for somebody one day, Lord. I want to be in a place in my life when I'm able to bless other people. I want to be in a place of flourishing where I can be a blessing to other people. And at that time in my life, I didn't feel like that was possible. And there was a long season where I didn't feel like that was possible. In fact, after that, I continued to work at that same job for 8 years, and I never got a raise. I think I got promoted once or twice, but I never actually got a raise because, other than just a little bump when I got promoted, because the economy wasn't doing well, and we were told we were just happy to have jobs. I met my husband around that time that I had that job, and he ended up losing his job during the crash of 2008. It was around the time we got married. And so we started off our marriage with unemployment for 3 years, and it was a very difficult season of just having enough. And I remember many times asking God, are we ever going to get out of this season? This was years where I was like, we're just making enough money. And every time we would have a little bit more, or it would seem like we would get a little bit more, there'd be another expense to cover. And I would be thankful that we could cover the expense, but it was like we just had enough every single time. We had to trust God for just enough, just enough, just enough, which is what a wilderness is like. He always provides for you, but it's just what you need. It's never more than you need. And I always longed for the time that I would have more than I needed because I did want to be a blessing to other people. That was something I desired to be able to do. So finally, and I shared this a couple weeks ago on the other episode, a door opened for me to have a new job, and it came out of the blue. And again, it didn't come easy. It came with opposition. It came with a season of opposition where I had to face some challenges for the first 9 months I was there, I think. And it wasn't easy. And I talk about that more in that episode, but I won't get into that now. But eventually I got to this time where I was flourishing, where all of this opposition, all of the things I had been working for, all of the things I had been doing through that time period and relying and depending on God through that season of opposition, suddenly it felt like I was in a harvest season and there was favor on my life and there was blessing on my life, and others were beginning to notice how well I was doing or compliment me on where I was, and I was thinking about this with the seasons of Israel. We talked about the seasons of the Middle East and what happens in the agricultural season. There's that time in the winter when there's all of these rains. The latter rains happen through the winter into the spring, and there's heavy rain and there's storms that come with that rain. That rain is what helps to produce the wheat and the barley to bring it to full maturity so that it can grow and be harvested. At the same time, the land is transforming and it's turning lush. It's full of life. It's full of greenery, and there's lots of flowers blooming. And it's the same with our life. Like, we can see the evidence of flourishing happening when you come to this season of harvest where people are able to partake in the things that are the gifts of your life, the things that are on your life. People are experiencing those things. So all of that stuff that God has cultivated in you through the time of wilderness, through the time of growth, through the time of opposition, in the middle of the growth, now it's coming to full maturity and others are seeing it on your life. And they're complimenting you for the qualities that you carry, for the gifts that you have, for the things that they're experiencing in their own life. I remember my client giving me a huge compliment that first year. After that first year I was at the company, and my boss was there and he overheard it and he complimented me. And it was so fulfilling to receive that compliment and to think, wow, I'm finally in a place where I felt like I was on top of the world, like I was on top of a mountaintop. And now I'm finally experiencing this blessing that I've been wanting for so long, where there was more than I needed. And there was the blessing and the favor on my life, but there was also the support that I had and the grace on my life and the compliments and the people noticing the abilities that I had. There's two different ways we can look at this too. There's times that we receive compliments and people recognize the gifts on our life, and we want to go into like this false humility of like, oh, it's all God. It's all God, and that's something you hear a lot in church where people will get a compliment and then they're like, oh, it's just the Lord's blessing, or it's just God on my life. And I feel like sometimes that's a false humility because God is the one that has cultivated and gifted us in those ways, but they are still part of us. It's still okay to say thank you. It's okay to just say thank you when someone compliments you. The thing that is important, though, is to still recognize that it all comes from God. And so we take those compliments we receive and we go to the Father and we say, thank you, Lord, for what you're doing in my life. Thank you for providing for me. Thank you for everything you've cultivated in me. I recognize that I couldn't do this without you. I can't be this person without you. I would never be this person if it hadn't been for you. Like anything we are is only because of God. And so the temptation that we have in a season of flourishing is that we can become prideful if we're not careful. It's important that we continue to show gratitude to the Lord for everything that he is doing in our life and that we give him the glory for everything he's doing in our life. It doesn't mean that we live in false humility or that we have to be kind of weird about it, but we can recognize, we can say thank you, and we can also recognize that God is the one who is doing all of the work in us, who has helped us get to the place that we're in. And then we can become a blessing to others. And I can look back at that season and I can recognize times that God called me to be generous and I was generous. And there's also things that I recognize that I didn't do well and that I did allow pride to get into my life back then. There were times that I relished in the recognition. And I look back at that now and I can see that in my own life. And I don't like that I went there. I don't like that I got to that place. And I really feel like it's really because there was still insecurity in me. There was still things that needed to be worked out of me that I recognized in the wilderness after that is where God began to show me those things. And it's not that he shows us those things to beat us up or that we're to live in regret and feel terrible for what we experienced. But it's because he's getting ready to grow something new in us. And we have to let go of some of those things that are not becoming, that are not who we are, that are these false selves, this false sense of self that we have gathered. When we're really, truly confident and know our identity in the Lord, we don't need to be recognized anymore. We don't need that recognition from others because we get it from the Lord. But back then, I didn't really understand that. And so I began to live by the affirmation and the recognition of others. And then when I didn't receive it anymore, I was a mess. And so that's something I learned through that season. At the same time, there was a generosity that was cultivated in me in that season. And I remember feeling as though the more I gave out, the more was provided. The more I gave out, the more was provided. And I got this sense that there was never a lack. There was always more than enough. I think the challenge, and something that God has been challenging me with, is remembering that season and knowing that really that's how we're always to live. And I think when we go through a season where we experience flourishing, one thing that's really helpful is to journal everything that we're experiencing. To journal those things that God's doing in us, to journal those blessings that are coming into our life, to remember those things, because eventually we will enter a wilderness season again. That season will dry up. Unfortunately, flourishing doesn't last forever. And if I think about it in the actual span of time, if you look at it from the Middle East, that season of time that things are harvested and flourishing is a very small window of time. And then everything dries up and we're back in a dry season again, a long, dry wilderness season. And then it starts all over again with a season of growth or a season of pruning and cultivating. And so I just think that it's important when we're going through that time that we journal those things and we remember those things so that when we go into the wilderness, we can look back on that. We can hold on to those promises. We can hold on to those experiences and where we saw God's faithfulness and we saw the flourishing and remember those things. And ultimately, I believe that we're to live without lack, without that sense of lack. And I think God has to get us to a place where we recognize that he's always going to be there. He's always going to provide for us. And we experience a lot of that flourishing, that overflow in that season, where it's like the more we give out, the more we receive. When we go into a wilderness, we can continue to give out, but maybe it's not in the same way that we previously did. I don't want to jump ahead because I'll talk about more of this in the next episode, but I just think there's things that we can glean from that season of flourishing. And ultimately, it's also knowing, how does God want to steward that season, and asking him, what does he want us to do in the midst of that time? I think about Joseph in the Bible, and when he's in Pharaoh's court and things are going well in Egypt, and Pharaoh has a dream that shows him there's going to be 7 years where the land is going to be flourishing. There's going to be 7 years of abundance. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine following that season. And he's given that heads up. And because he receives that dream, Joseph has the wisdom to go to God and to ask him for direction on what to do about those seasons of flourishing, of those seasons of abundance. And he's able to set aside a portion of every single year. He's able to set aside a portion of that year to provide for those seasons of famine. And I think it's true in our own life as well, that when we go through a flourishing season, we need to ask the Lord how he wants us to steward that season financially, in every way. What does he want us to do that will better help us in the time of famine, so to speak? When we go through a season that's dry, when we go through a season that's difficult, what can we do to steward that season so that when the dry season comes, we have things that help us will get through that? It's not just about finances. It's also about what we can glean that we can hold on to when we're in a wilderness season. So if you've gone through that season of flourishing and you feel like you didn't live that season maybe the way that you wanted, maybe you regret some things from that time, don't beat yourself up, because God can overshadow with his grace the things that we've made mistakes on. I can look back and see where I missed it, but also recognize that God's grace has covered me. He's still provided everything I've needed, and he's resourced me in ways that I can never even imagine, despite my lack of wisdom in some areas. And so I want to leave you with that. I want to encourage you with that. And I'd love to hear from you below. Like, how does this speak to you? Is there some time in your life that you've experienced that flourishing season? What are you learning in the season you're in right now? What is God showing you? Feel free to comment below or send me a message. You can email me at info@nicoledelaney.com. Also, if you are a woman navigating a difficult transition or a challenging season and you are looking for some support, someone to come alongside you and just help you connect with God's voice and recognize what he's saying to you in this season, I have some coaching slots available. You can find more information on my website, nicoledelaney.com. I'll put that in the notes below. Feel free to reach out to me and we can start a conversation and just see if I can be of help to you. So I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you guys have a good week. I will talk with you again soon. Thanks.